Good morning again, everyone. I just want to take a quick second to do something a little bit different. This is, I guess, the most public platform I'll ever have. But if any of you have served in our military, can you please stand? In light of everything that's been going on recently in regards to the national anthem, I just wanted to personally take this time to thank you guys, because if it weren't for people like you, we would not have the freedom to be here in this church today. So I just want to tell you personally, thank you so much for your service to this country, and I think you should be held in the highest regard. So thank you very much. I just want to take that time to do that for a second. I recently read a book. It's called Move Toward the Mess, and it's a very good book. I would highly recommend anybody reading that, because it'll certainly pull you out of your comfort zone of what we're so used to in our Christian life. In fact, the title of my sermon today is called Move Toward the Mess. You might be asking yourself, why in the world would I move toward a mess? I have enough problems in my own life without getting involved with somebody else's life or somebody else's problems. And that's a fair question to ask, but I would also counter that question with, do you want to truly live out your Christian faith? After all, that is exactly what Jesus calls us to do. Our scripture reading for today comes from Matthew 25, verses 37 through 40, which says, "Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see thee hungry and feed thee, or thirsty and give thee drink? And when did we see a stranger and welcome thee, or naked and clothe thee? And when did we see thee sick or in prison and visit thee?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me.'" As I prepared for this message, I couldn't help but to ask my own self, or look at my own self in life, and wonder how I could model my life after that verse. And I'll be the first to tell you that moving toward a mess is the last thing I want to do, and it's something that makes you uncomfortable and makes me uncomfortable. I like for everything to be nice and orderly in my life, and for things to not get out of whack in any way. However, if I truly want to live the life Christ wants me to live, it may involve me giving of my time and possibly getting my hands dirty. And as we study the Bible, we see the types of people that Jesus hung around with. He spent his days with messy people in messy situations. He ate with crooked businessmen who cheated people out of their hard-earned money. He even hung out with prostitutes. He was constantly in the middle of all manner of messy situations, speaking words of grace and truth while chastising the religious leaders for keeping themselves aloof from these dear people who God loved. We're going to look at some of these stories and other current stories that reflect how Jesus wants us to move toward the mess. Let's first take a look at the story of Jesus having dinner at Matthew's house. After Jesus had gone to Matthew and asked him to follow him, Matthew threw a banquet in honor of Jesus at Matthew's house. And who do you think showed up at this party? It was a whole bunch of other tax collectors, just like Matthew. It was some of the most despised and despicable people of that time. I can't think of anything to equate what a tax collector would be like these days, but from what I've read, they were pretty hated group of people. So most people will walk into that room and see that group of people and turn and walk the other way and not think twice about it. But not Jesus. He stayed in that room with them, and those are just the type of people he loved to be with. In fact, in those verses, we read that Jesus was reclined at the table eating with the tax collectors. Now, I know that reclining was traditionally how they ate during Jesus' time, but as I read that and studied that more, I couldn't help but think, him being in that reclined position also reflected how comfortable he was with those people. When you think of somebody reclining, you think they're comfortable, they're at ease, they have no problems with what's going on in the world, they're fine. And that's exactly how I view Jesus, being around those people. Now, when we're around certain people, are we relaxed, or do we tense up and we can't wait for them to leave? We just want them to go away. Could you imagine how things would have been different if Jesus would have responded the way we typically do when we're around a certain group of people? it certainly would have played out a lot differently than what it did. Another story that I'd like to share is one that I experienced recently. And it's sometimes seemingly everyday experiences that God can use to get our attention and cause us to think outside of ourselves and into the messes that are around us. As I've told you all before, both Allison and I are animal lovers. Sometimes I think it's more of a curse than anything because we can't say no to any homeless animal that's out there. But that leads me to a story that I want to share with you in regards to an animal that we recently rescued. Many of you know where we live. It's here in Norwood Hollow. And we have a natural area that's out in the front yard and close to the road. And one day we were in the process of putting out mulch in this natural area. And when I started to go out and work, I heard a meow, like a faint cat cry coming from the distance. And over across the road from us, there is an old empty trailer. And I walked over to that trailer to see if that's where the noise was coming from and what in the world this cat was meowing for. And as I got closer, I heard something running, or sounded like the cat was in the trailer running around. Well, I knelt down and looked underneath the trailer, and I saw that this kitten had somehow gotten in this netting that's up underneath the trailer, and he was stuck, and he couldn't get away. And the harder he struggled to get away, the tighter that netting got around his leg. So I ran back across the street to the house, and I got a knife, and I went and I cut the cat free. And the whole time he was hissing and he was biting me, and I was thinking, it'd be much easier to free a rattlesnake at this point than this little kitten, because he's pretty mad. But I got him out, and he took off running, and he never looked back. And as I worked through the day, I kept thinking about that little kitten and how that is very much similar to how our lives are. We can get in messy, sticky situations. We can get wrapped up and entangled in our own messes. And the harder we try to get away from that, we just entangle even more in the mess. We don't look to God for help. We don't look to anyone else for help. And sometimes when we are set free, we run away and never look back to the one that freed us. Well, that night, I went to bed feeling pretty good about the fact that I'd saved this little kitten. It always feels good when you help someone or something that's in a desperate situation. So all day Friday, I worked even more on this natural area, putting mulch out. And then later on that evening, Allison and I were out there looking at all the work that we had done. But I had this weird sensation that this kitten was stuck again. So I walked over to that same trailer to look, and sure enough, he was stuck again. But this time he was further up under the trailer, and he was entangled really bad this time, worse than the day before. So just like the day before, I got a knife, and I had to climb up under this trailer, which was muddy and wet, and there were some old boards and nails that I had to crawl over to get him out. Well, this time I was cutting him out, and I thought, well, I can't let him go, because the poor little thing, the stuff that was wrapped around his leg had gotten so tight that his foot had swollen up because of the lack of circulation. So I took my shirt off, and I wrapped around this little kitten, and I cut him free. Well, I climbed back out from underneath the trailer, and as I came out, I'm standing there. It had started raining, so I was covered in mud, soaking wet, and my neighbor is standing at his front door just looking at me. And here I am, soaking wet, covered in mud, holding this kitten in my shirt. But I didn't care because I wanted to save that little kitten. So I put myself in this situation, and I didn't care what anybody thought when they saw me. I knew I just wanted to help this little cat. And it seems funny that I'm telling a story about this little kitten, but God can use those stories to help you reflect on how we approach life. And I thought to myself, what if we approach people in their messy situations the same way I approached that kitten? Like we didn't care how dirty we got. We didn't care what anybody thought if they saw us helping this person. Because, a lot of times when you go to help someone, somebody in your family or friends might say, what in the world are you doing helping them? You know that they're whatever it may be. But if we approach people in that different way, the way Jesus would look at them, it would change so much. And I just couldn't help but parallel that with the story of that kitten. And we've all made messes in our lives. In fact, we know a mess when we see one because we've been one at some point. It's something that we all have in common. Our messes may bring us together or may Our messes bring us together, but they also make us feel separated from God. When we can't live up to our own standards, how can we live up to God's standards? We assume our messes disappoint or anger our Heavenly Father, but the truth is, the mess that brings us together is the mess that brought God near. The Bible is full of stories that are messy. We can learn so much from how these messes were addressed, be it by the person that made the mess or by someone else that had compassion for that person in the messy situation they were in. So how do you define a mess? What do you think of when you think of a mess? The definition for the word mess is a dirty or untidy state of things. It is also defined as a situation or state of affairs that is confused or full of difficulties. I think that pretty much sums up what a mess is and what we think of when we think of a mess. And we've all been in a state of confusion while facing many difficulties in our lives. Our lives can get pretty messy at times, be it with our health, finances, marriages, or relationships, and so on. Have you ever been drawn to someone's mess by compassion for that person or the situation? How did you react? Did you reflect on the stories that you read in the Gospels of how Jesus reacted to the people in the New Testament? Were you moved to go toward the mess, but you were held back by fear of what someone might think of you? Or better yet, were you afraid of what it might require of you? It's easy to feel compassion for someone from afar, but to become involved with the mess, it may require that you need to get your hands dirty. Moving toward a mess may draw you out of your comfort zone. Sometimes you may think that you're not qualified to help someone with their mess. I'm going to share a story with you shortly that tells of how one couple has had a tremendous impact on their community. They weren't qualified. They didn't have a big plan put together to address the mess that they were drawn to. The only thing they had were genuine compassion and love for a certain group of people in their community. You may be someone that has moved toward the mess and you put away all the fears and doubts you had to help someone just as Jesus did. Sometimes you may wonder how your own life got to be so messy, and if you feel that way, you're not alone. As I said, there are many stories in the Bible that deal with messy situations or people. Another one that I want to talk about is the story of the leper that we're all familiar with in the book of Matthew. Now, leprosy was a highly communicable disease, and it left the body in utter mess. It caused skin lesions, damage to the nervous system, tissue loss, finger and toe deformities. And one of the greatest risks for contracting this disease was by touch. Lepers had to announce when they were approaching people. This will give people time to get out of the way and not run the risk of coming in contact with the leper. Can you imagine how humiliating that life would be to lead a lonely life of a leper, never being touched or hugged by their family ever again, or anyone else for that matter? If you were diagnosed with leprosy, you were sentenced to a life of loneliness. In Matthew 8, it describes how a man with leprosy approaches Jesus. As the man approaches Jesus, Jesus did not recoil in disgust or was not put out by the fact of this leper approaching him. When the leper asked if Jesus was willing to heal him, what did Jesus do? He moved toward the mess of this man. Although it does not say this in the Bible, I can just imagine the gasp and the horrified looks on the people's faces as this leper approaches Jesus. You know, Jesus could have healed this man with a word, but I think he did something extraordinary, and I think it further revealed the compassion and love Jesus had for this man. He reaches out his hand and touches the leper. To me, the gesture of Jesus touching this man was a greater deed than the actual healing. Knowing the facts of leprosy and how highly contagious the disease is really puts into context what Jesus did by touching this man. The interaction between the leper and Jesus is very brief, but within those verses, I think there's so much to be drawn from that we can learn from that story. We may think to ourselves that we are not qualified to help someone, or that we don't have a plan in place to help someone. However, sometimes it can be something as simple as a touch or a kind word that leaves an impression on someone. Simple gestures can have a major impact on someone's life. We may think that it takes a great amount of knowledge or know-how to help someone, but it's not necessarily the case. And that's exactly what Leroy and Janelle Lamar did. In 2005, the Lamars moved to the Capitol View neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, this neighborhood was an older neighborhood, and it had some homes in it that were fixed up, but it had a lot of homes in it that were run down or older and abandoned. And they moved into the neighborhood because it was something that they could afford as a young couple, and it was convenient to their work. Around the corner from their house was the intersections of DeSoto and Genesee streets. On one corner, there was a crack house. On the other corner, there was a brothel. And on the other corner, there was a halfway house for addicts. Most people would look at this intersection and walk the other way, and that's exactly what Leroy and Janelle did initially. However, they were friends with another couple in the neighborhood, Peter and Jessica Gross, and they saw things differently than others did. Instead of seeing a neighborhood as a lost cause, they saw it as an opportunity. And in 2006, they started something called Hot Dogs and Prayers. They decided to set up a little stand at the intersection of DeSoto and Genesee streets, where all these houses were that I just explained were located. They were at the intersection every Sunday evening at 5 p.m. where they gave away hot dogs and asked people how they could pray for them. Nothing more than that, just something that simple. They didn't have any tracts to pass out or a bus to whisk them away to a church. They didn't even have a plan together. They just had hot dogs and prayers. Eventually, this couple asked Leroy and Janelle, the Lamars, who had just recently moved into the neighborhood, to join them at their hot dog stand, and both couples were there every Sunday night until they ran out of hot dogs. They had drug dealers, addicts, prostitutes, families with kids, and older people who had seen better days in the neighborhood come by every Sunday night. Through these encounters, Leroy and Janelle got to know their neighbors, and their neighbors got to know them. As they learned more about these people and their stories, Leroy and Janelle's heart began to change. They no longer saw them as bad people who should be locked up, but as people they wanted to get to know better. They were starting to see these individuals as Jesus had seen people in the New Testament. Through their encounters, Leroy and Janelle became really close to one of the prostitutes in their neighborhood named Rita. Rita noticed right away that Leroy and Janelle were interested in her as a person and not as a body. It wasn't long before Rita started to come to Leroy and Janelle's house every week, and despite becoming part of the Lamar household, she still worked the streets. Then Janelle became pregnant. She was told she was going to have twins, and Rita thought for sure that this would be the end of their friendship, but it didn't. Even when Janelle became visibly more pregnant, they still welcomed Rita into their home. By now, Rita was seriously considering getting off the streets for good. However, the handful of nonprofit organizations in the area that worked with women to get them off the streets were full, and they had no room for her. So Leroy and Janelle did the unthinkable. They moved Rita into their home. Did you hear that? They didn't just move toward the mess. They fully embraced it by having this former prostitute move into their house with them, despite the fact they were getting ready to have twins and a major transformation of their own lives getting ready to take place. Life with Rita wasn't easy, and it was still very messy at times. It took a lot of patience and love for Rita's complete transformation. Given what she had been through and the type of life she was living, her transformation was not going to happen overnight. Leroy and Janelle had no training in assisting a woman with her type of background, but that didn't stop them because they were determined to love Rita no matter what. By loving her unconditionally, Leroy and Janelle were able to start seeing progress in Rita's transformation. Leroy and Janelle Lamar's love and treatment for Rita were certainly above and beyond what most people, I think, would do with a person like Rita. They gave themselves so unselfishly, and it was a real risk to invite someone like that into their home. If you read through the Gospels, this is exactly what Jesus would have done and the type of life he wants us to live. The Lamars modeled Jesus' behavior and had a tremendous impact on Rita's life. It not only helped her, but they have gone on to help a large number of other women just like Rita in the Atlanta area. In fact, they started a nonprofit of their own in 2012 called Serenity Steps. It's a program that helps former prostitutes get off the streets and start a new life for themselves. So I just found that amazing just to see what this couple did with this lady, the risk that it was for them to invite her into their household. It was just amazing. When I think about that, would I have done that? And right now, I don't know that I would. It's very difficult to look at that and try to mimic that lifestyle of Jesus. It's very difficult and it can be demanding at times. But like I said, if you want to truly live your Christian life and follow the way Jesus did, it would require you doing things like this. Now, we've discussed a few stories today of people moving toward the mess. Some have been rather mild, while others have been more extreme. You don't have to quit your day job and throw yourself fully into moving toward a mess. You don't even need to go out in search of a mess, because someone may be looking for someone just like you in your own neighborhood, church, or school. You don't even have to have a big plan put together as to how you're going to help someone. God can use you right where you are now. He has chosen you specifically to do His work right where you are. You don't have to go far away from home. If you're a stay-at-home parent, a student, or a person with a full-time job, just look around. When you step outside of yourself and look at other people's lives, you will notice messy situations right away. So what do we take away from these stories? I know for me, it's difficult to think about involving myself in situations that may make me feel uncomfortable or require my time. I believe this is exactly what Jesus is calling us to do. What is witnessing after all? It's sharing your love for Jesus with others. Granted, you can do this in several ways, but I feel as though God is calling us to take deliberate action and be His feet in spreading the gospel and spreading love for others. This world is clearly hurting, and it needs the love of Jesus. A simple warm meal or giving clothes. This goes back to our scripture reading for today. I don't know about you all, but I plan to make some uncomfortable changes to be the hands and feet of Jesus, and I hope you will join me in my decision. Thank you. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this day. Thank you for this message that you brought to me. And as we see people in life in messy situations, I ask, Lord, that you would help us to step out of our own comfort zones and move toward the people that are hurting and need you so dearly or badly in their lives. And I just pray that you would just convict us of this each and every day. Amen.